episode 456 of Retro Encounter, RPG fans' bi-weekly podcast of many topics. I'm your host today, Zach Wilkerson, and we are here to talk about the games that made us. Those formative games, not necessarily our favorite games, but those formative games that really set out, what we love about RPGs, what we love about games, maybe taught us things about ourselves. There are a lot of different approaches we can take. There's going to be a feature which with many people from RPG Fan participating in it that will go up probably a couple weeks after this episode. It was written a long time ago, but Game of the Year stuff got in the way. But before we dig more into that, let's introduce the panel, starting with you, Lucas.
Hi.
And Paul.
Hello, everyone.
And Ben.
Hi.
Awesome. I'm so happy to chat with the three of you. Some of you I haven't talked to for a while, and I always love having all three of you on, so I'm excited about this. And I will say that there is a lot of variety in the games that we've chosen. So for the feature itself, I allowed people to choose 5 games that sort of were formative experiences for them, taught them what they appreciated in games or whatever, and then 2 non-RPGs. There is no possible way we could do that in this episode and it not go 6 hours, which would be a Retro Encounter record. And I don't want to, I think that I've probably been on some record breaking episodes for length already. So I'm going to try not to do that today. So instead, what I had the panelists decide on was 2 games, like maybe the 2 most formative games, and then also 1 non-RPG. So the 2 most formative RPGs and then 1 non-RPG. And so we'll just kind of go through and talk about each one. Obviously, all of us have varying experiences with them, and talk about what that means. But again, I want to say before we dig in here, these are not necessarily our favorite games, although 2 of mine are like 2 of my 5 favorite games, but that's just sort of the way it worked out. So yeah, we've got 12 games to talk about, so let's get rolling here. Who wants to get started by talking about one of their formative RPGs?
I can start.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So first on my list is Fire Emblem for the Game Boy Advance, also known as Fire Emblem: The Blazing Blade or Fire Emblem 7, depending. And the reason why I picked this one is because it's both my favorite game of all time and probably the game that really got me interested in video games as something that I'm really passionate about. And as more than just like a diversion. I'd played other games, before, other RPGs before, but this game is really the one that, like, when I played it, I was like, oh, video games are like really interesting, and the mechanics and the story and everything. So I remember the first time I ever saw this game was in homeroom in the 4th grade. And this kid named Taylor, who I wasn't actually really friends with, I didn't even particularly like, but he had his Game Boy Advance out and he was playing this game. And he was on, which I believe it's chapter 20, which is the chapter where it's a fog of war. And you're in like the city, and there's like wyverns flying out of the fog and to attack your army. And I just thought that was like the coolest thing I'd ever seen. And I was really into like fantasy, medieval fantasy kind of stuff at the time. So I was like, oh, I gotta find this. Beg my mom, for the game. And I did eventually get it. And the really interesting thing about this game is that it's the first Fire Emblem that they ever localized for a Western audience. So they took great pains to make the game very easy to get into for people who've never played strategy RPG before, never played Fire Emblem before. And the initial like route of the game is Lynn's story, which is basically like a big tutorial. Teaches you all the mechanics and gets you invested in this kind of like miniature storyline before you get into the main story. And that was perfect for me because I'd never really played a tactics game before, a strategy RPG before. And it really, kind of immerses you in the world and the mechanics. And that was just such a great experience. And then, tactical RPGs are like my favorite type of game now. And I would largely credit it to this game.
I'm really glad you brought up Fire Emblem, which interestingly we have never had a game journal for on
I
Retro
know,
Encounter ever.
Zach. I've got to talk to you about that. We have to do it. We have to do it. I know it's come up in voting before,
Yeah.
and like we've got to do it.
I mean, I'm game because I have never, I have only actually ever played one Fire Emblem game and I only played it for like 12 hours. And it was, you probably guessed it, Awakening. And
Mhm.
I'll be honest with you, like, I thought that it wasn't great. I thought it was like super easy. Like, I just like,
Yes.
I was like, I took Frederick and Frederick just like solos the entire army. Okay, cool.
Yes.
And then I had chosen like a male main character, which turned out to be like a colossal mistake. I realized, and I got mad, and then just quit. Um, but I always like, to me, coming back to some of those like original Fire Emblem games, because I'm not the biggest strategy fan, but like Final Fantasy Tactics was almost one of my choices because like the storytelling in that game was just so amazing. But I'd already chosen another Final Fantasy game, so I was like, I can't do that one. And so like I like tactics games, and I really enjoyed triangle strategy, but like Fire Emblem is something I haven't gotten into, so there is a possibility that it might find its way to a poll very soon here. Don't you worry.
Good, good. I love to hear that because, yeah, I mean, I think it's like, yeah, like you're saying, you played Awakening. I think a lot of people got introduced to this series through either Awakening or more recently Three Houses. And I think there's a lot of things that Fire Emblem for the GBA does better than those games, but is also really similar. So like, there's three different storyline routes through Fire Emblem for the GBA, which is similar to the Three Houses, where you have the three story routes. There's also, like Awakening did a lot to kind of make the series more accessible to new players, and this game also did a lot to do that. But it still has a lot of the classic elements that I prefer. I agree with you, Zach. Awakening is one of my least favorite games in the series, and it's mainly because it's very easy and mechanically very unbalanced. And this game doesn't have those problems. And it's such a rich, like the storyline's very good, the characters are really interesting and enjoyable, and it has there's so many little secrets and things like that. So it's just a really, really great game, and I think anybody who likes tactical RPGs or Fire Emblem in general hasn't gone back and played this one definitely should play it.
I really need to. I've been meaning to get back to that. I've played it when it came out, which I was in college at the time, and had played some games like I think at that point I'd probably played a little bit of Nippon Ichi stuff, and then also like Final Fantasy Tactics. But jumping into Fire Emblem, it was definitely a very different kind of experience, and I remember that game be like the original was it Blazing Blade being one of my favorites at the time, and also being very upset that they chose boring characters like Marth to put in Smash Brothers instead of Lynn, who is just awesome. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, what's actually interesting you bring up Smash Brothers, because that's actually why they decided to localize this game, is because they put Marth and Roy into Melee, and then people in the West were like, "Who are
who?
these people?"
Yeah, that's exactly how I was.
Yeah, and
What?
so they're like, "Oh, well, we should bring one over," because they were really popular in Melee, and then that changed the direction of the development of the game, because then they had to make Lynn's story, which they weren't originally planning to do. Um, so, and that's it ends up it's a prequel to Roy's game, which was the previous one released on the GBA, which we never got, but there is a good fan translation for. So uh, people can always go back and play it. But yeah, it's that was Melee is kind of the genesis of Fire Emblem in the West.
And this is really interesting. I mean, I've got a big blind spot for strategy RPGs as a whole, but also Fire Emblem specifically. And when you mentioned it to start with, I thought you were talking about, is this the original Fire Emblem? This is the very first one, but no, this is like the seventh one. Yeah. Um, so it's fascinating to hear the possibilities of this as a maybe an entry point, maybe a little bit less accessible nowadays. But would you see it as something that would be good if we saw a new entry? of this, or a remake or a port onto something, make it more accessible?
Yeah, I mean, it is on NSO, the
Oh, it
Nintendo
is.
Switch
Oh,
Online.
great.
Yeah,
Mm.
so if anybody has that, then you can just go play it right now.
Ah.
But I know there's been rumors of a remake of this one and the previous one, which is the Binding Blade, which is the one that has Roy. But there's also rumors of like a remake of Genealogy of the Holy War and possibly Thracia 776, which are the fourth and fifth game respectively. So Intelligent Systems, they really like to go back and do remakes of the Fire Emblem games. They've done that now 3 times. So I think eventually they'll probably get here as long as Fire Emblem stays popular. But you know, the games continue to do well. So, but I would recommend everybody just play the original version on Nintendo Switch Online or however other way you can play it, because it has those really good GBA sprite work, which
Mhm.
they probably wouldn't carry over to a remake. So there's still reasons to play the original now for sure.
I think that might be happening when I get off this call. I'm like, oh man, I'm really hankering for it. But one game that I know for sure that I will not be playing when I get off this call because I've played it a bunch of times is one of Lucas's games. Look at that. That's a transition. There we go. Lucas, why don't you talk about one of your formative RPGs?
Sounds good. Anyone who has heard me on this or Rhythm Encounter will probably not be terribly surprised that Lufia 2 Rise of the Sinistrals is one of my formative games. It's I remember renting it when I was a kid. I never actually owned it as a kid, but it always stood out to me because it had the puzzle dungeons as opposed to just the more maze that you wander through and get random encounters dungeon that most games had at the time. And honestly, like the puzzle tools in that are as good as, if not better than, a lot of early Zelda games that might have drawn influence there. Lots of little block puzzles and stuff. Uh, the characters are great. The story is a lot of fun. A lot of the beginning stuff is really basic. Town dungeon, fix the problems, beat the bad guy. But something about the ending is just really impactful, and I still gets me a little choked up every time I play it. And I think just in terms of how I think about RPGs, one of the biggest things it has is a system where every piece of equipment has a unique skill tied to it that you can use, kind of like a limit break kind of thing, except for a little bit less flashy, which means even late game, there are pieces of equipment that you may want to use just because they give you this skill, even if the stats aren't as good. It really makes equipment matter, and it gives you this customization that I feel like is something I value in a lot of RPGs, and that is something that made me fall off of some games. Like, I've never been a huge fan of like some of a lot of the later Final Fantasy games because they stopped having, equipment that you could switch around between characters and stuff. It always felt, just really linear. And
Yeah.
then, of course, the absolute most important part of Lufia 2 is the Ancient Cave, which is a 99 floor randomly generated dungeon. Uh, there is a boss at the end. All the treasures are random. And in addition to just being kind of my introduction to roguelikes, I would say, is also the thing that got me into making YouTube videos. My very first videos were because I had was looking into ancient cave runs, and a friend was like, "I'd watch that." And now almost 8 years later, caused a problem in my life, or at least my schedule.
A lot to blame
Yeah,
it for then. I mean, are there
yeah.
many links between the first Lufia and the second one? And was there a reason that the second one appealed to you or affected you more than the first?
Unfortunately, the first Lufia game is really mediocre.
Oh,
Most of the actually, just in general, most of the Lufia series is like every game is very different, and I feel like the first one was very like kind of like a Dragon Questy kind of game where there wasn't a lot to it.
mm.
I mean,
No
it's
offense to
still like
Dragon Quest.
if you were targeting an enemy that died, it still whiffed and swung like Final Fantasy One style.
Oh no.
There are all kinds of
Yeah.
problems with the first Lufia.
Yeah.
It was very old school and very clunky. It didn't have the puzzles. It didn't have it. And the story was fine, and the gameplay was very basic but fine. It's not a bad game. It's just not a good game.
Mm.
I mean,
uh,
what's interesting too is that like the very best part of Lufia 1 is the part that has the characters from Lufia 2.
that is also
um,
true.
yeah, I mean, because Lufia 2 is a prequel. Yeah, sorry. Keep going, Lucas.
Yeah, no, it is literally that is the connecting point. Is literally the first thing you do in Lufia 1 is play as the characters from Lufia 2, play the last boss fight. And they ended up going back and redoing like that whole story leading up to that.
Yeah, I mean, if I didn't know for a fact that Lucas was going to choose Lufia 2 because we all have a brand, right? Lufia 2 is your brand, Lucas.
It
I,
is.
it would have potentially it would have been in the running for me for sure. When it came out, I would say that it was my favorite Super Nintendo RPG, probably my favorite RPG period. In retrospect, I think that Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasy VI might be better, but Lufia 2, I just connected with the characters so strongly. And one of the things that I'll talk about when I get to my first one is that, especially when I was younger, it was the characters that really mattered to me. And I loved these characters. And there's such a pace to it. Like Lufia 2, when I went back to play it for Retro Encounter, it was actually my very first game journal for Retro Encounter. It moves and it has a pace, and like the monsters that you can collect a little bit on the side are fun. There's just enough customization. There's like some weird challenge things that you can try to do with like gaties early, and the dungeon's great, and it's just it does puzzles the right way, even though some of them are not very friendly to colorblind people like me. But I think Lufia 2 is just a fabulous game and an excellent choice. And I'm always excited when people are talking about it. And the boss music is so good.
Yeah, I
Yes.
really think that the puzzle design in Lufia 2 and the way that it integrates like puzzles into the dungeons and everything is like so influential. Like you have like Wild Arms or Golden Sun, for example, that would really heavily, lean on that kind of design. I think it makes like the typical maze-like dungeon of an RPG a lot more engaging, and like those games owe so much to Lufia 2 because it's really, even though I think there's other games that had puzzles in their kind of RPG dungeons, but the way that it's executed in Lufia 2 is like so influential to those games that would come later.
Yeah, it's real good. I'm glad you got the chance to talk about it, Lucas. So that's a game I am extremely familiar with, but there is a game that I had heard of, but I've never played. And I watched a bunch of videos for it, and I was like, it's probably good that I haven't played this. But Paul's played it. So Paul, talk to us about one of your formative RPGs.
Yeah, so I guess we're going to start with the game Eye of the Beholder from the early 90s, because that's when I was a teenager. Um, and the strange thing about this, yeah, it's for those who don't know, yeah, it's probably been lost to the mists of time, and I'm not sure it would massively hold up now either if you went back to it. It's a game you might be, if you're familiar with the subject matter, you might tell from the name. It's a game based in the AD&D, as it was back then, Dungeons and Dragons now world, specifically the Forgotten Realms, the main setting, or controversial thing to say, I suppose. Um, It's a first-person kind of dungeon crawler, and for me, it was very influential because I'd played similar things at a friend's house on their Atari, I think, an older, even older dungeon crawler called Dungeon Master, and it had really appealed to me because I was, as many of us are, I guess, into that the fantasy elements, fantasy novels, Dungeons and Dragons. I was a huge fan of their Dragonlance setting and Dragonlance books. And this, so Dungeon Master is great, but when I the Beholder came out, that was a link for me between my love of literature and fantasy writing and this emergent world of video games and being able to immerse yourself inside of them. It's kind of strange because it doesn't have the thing that draws me most nowadays, as it always has, which is narrative and story. It's not particularly strong here. You're essentially just, you're told by the rulers of Waterdeep, a city in the Forgotten Realms, you've got to go and, there's something bad happening in the sewers. Just go, and you do, and the cave crumbles behind your characters, and then off you go, slaying Dungeons and Dragons monsters left and right. You get to pick your party, which was amazing for me back then, back in the early 90s. You could pick this, from the familiar character classes, mage, clerics, thieves, paladins, and you got to pick a little portrait of your character as well. So this was, this absolutely blew my mind. And it was that kind of early 90s Dungeons and Dragons art as well, which I still absolutely love. The gameplay was quite compelling. It's quite challenging. Um, it is difficult, and there's little things you have to kind of click around the screen to find secret doors. It's like a barely marked brick on a wall that you've got to find through the powers of extremely good perception, or get stuck more likely, as I did. Um, and it just really, as I said, for me, it was a bridge into something greater. And I don't know, it's not something I've continued greatly in the future, in the sense that I know that we've had loads of great dungeon crawlers come out in various different genres, and in the JRPG genre, I know we've got the whole Etrian Odyssey and things like that, don't we, series, which probably stem back to these early days a little bit. I think they're referencing these kind of things, I'm sure, but I don't have much experience with them, in the same way that early JRPGs were inspired by early Western RPGs as well. I think there's a definite evolution there. But yeah, that's what it was for me. That's what this game is, and it still sort of lurks in my memory as something that just gave me that thrill of adventure within a video game format that I'd only been able to get from reading fantasy books before then.
Yeah, I have not played this game. I mean, I'd heard of it, but
Mm.
I think I was watching some videos of it, and it seems like it has a little point and click to it with
Yeah.
the with sort of trying to figure out some of those puzzles. Looks like the combat is not super in depth, but you
No.
have a lot of like sort of you have a lot of ability to adjust sort of the way you approach different encounters and things like that based on the party that you have, which I think is very cool. And I think you're right. I'm not a big dungeon crawler fan, although I know we have at least one person on this podcast who is a big dungeon crawler fan, as in Etrian Odyssey.
Mm.
So Ben, have you ever played Eye of the Beholder?
So I haven't played Eye of the Beholder. However, Paul, you were mentioning a connection between Etrian Odyssey and this game, and I do know of a connection between the two.
Oh.
So I know that Eye of the Beholder had a port to the Sega CD, and that version has music composed by Yuzo Koshiro, who is one of the main composers for Etrian Odyssey.
That's fascinating.
Um, yeah, yeah. So that's like a neat little connection. And I don't know for a fact, but I would imagine that having worked on that, on the Sega CD version of Eye of the Beholder, probably influenced, his interest in working on other dungeon crawlers in the future. So that's kind of a neat little bridge between the two, like you were talking about, Paul.
Yeah, it's brilliant that they would do that, and it's also just really interesting to think of that localization process going in the other direction. You don't hear about that so often all the time. We're often talking about localization from our perspective of Japanese Japanese pieces of entertainment coming over to us. But that's amazing, and that you found a connection between the two is great. I'm amazed that anyone found any facts about this. It's as I said, pretty much not one that sticks out in the consciousness now, and not one, unlike Lufia 2. I wouldn't be recommending people go hunt it out. You're
I
probably
mean,
No.
what version of it did you play, Paul? Did you play the PC version or
It was the Amiga.
the Amiga version?
Yeah,
Okay.
being European, in
That
the
makes sense.
UK. Yeah, it was a big deal back then. It was gaming system I was extremely chuffed to have as well. So getting this game again, the graduation from playing something previously I would have been playing like on a Spectrum 128K, probably, you know, little platform games and things like that. The graduation from that to this, as well as is why again it's formative. It was just so really expanded my idea of what video games can actually do.
Yeah, there's
I
some really great looking games on the Amiga. Yeah.
Mhm. It's funny because I was watching some clips from the Sega CD version of it, and the music is great, but the voice acting is the worst voice acting I've ever seen in a video game. So it's like I kind of want to play this. So I'm just curious. Like the Sega CD is such a weird system.
what?
There's some
The
cool stuff
voice
on there.
acting from 1994 wasn't good? You say it ain't so.
Look, I still like the voice acting on the Lunar games. So
That's fair. That's fair. No, this is definitely one that I wish I had like played when I was younger, but it just never came up. And I do remember seeing articles about it and stuff, like in Nintendo Power probably or something. But and I'd played Dungeon Master. So I had even played this style of game before. And I also do like Etrian Odyssey quite a bit. So I'm very surprised must have been a gap in the middle there. But I do remember those type of games being very clunky. Uh, so I am also not surprised to hear you say that it's not necessarily one to go back to.
Yeah, clunky is an apt description, I think, even from memory. And I can't imagine how they would have controlled on a gamepad as well.
Yeah, that was yeah. Like I played Dungeon Master on a PC, but there's other like first person games um like I think like the wizardry games and stuff like that were on NES, and those are very hard to control most of the time, or very simple, or a little of both.
I mean, I think it's part of what makes the original Fantasy Star sort of going, off here. Like as a dungeon crawler, the way that it controls like really works well. So I think that it's just interesting to see like those corridor dungeon things like that were really popular. Have sort of become like a very small niche, but like the different ways people were doing it back then, I think is interesting.
Yeah, it allows it to live in that early format. I know we're talking Fantasy Star as well. It allows it kind of to live in your mind. You can't see your characters on the screen, but you've got some kind of portrait or something like that. So it's really pushing the available technology at the time much further than if they were to actually have tried to represent that in front of you like they did later on when they had more resources.
Ooh, speaking of pushing technology, I've got this one. This is a good transition. So one of mine, and if you've listened to Retro Encounter, I've been on a lot of episodes, and I've talked about this one before. Is probably the most commonly played game on here. Is Final Fantasy IV, which we talked about recently. When we first, see that Mode 7 flight of the airships at the beginning of that game, just so captivating. And you realize later that the SNES was capable of much more than that, but it was amazing to me. And for a lot of people, I think on staff, Final Fantasy IV was their first RPG, if they're my age ish. But that wasn't true for me. I had played a number of them on the regular Nintendo, but I couldn't ever really play them without a fair amount of help from my grandparents. Like Dragon Warrior 2 was the first RPG I ever beat. And I can tell you for a fact I did not do that on my own. I had someone over my shoulder telling me exactly how much I needed to grind and everything else. But Final Fantasy IV, it was a game that like I remember watching my grandparents play it before I got to, and just being amazed at like these large, as we're talking about, these large fantasy concepts of dragoons and dark knights and these like huge sort of contrasts and binary ideas that Final Fantasy IV deals with, and this over the top melodramatic storytelling. But in particular, it was like the characters that really, I loved the characters, and they're, you know, obviously in a modern sense that the characters aren't, you know, any great shakes. They're these really, uh, you know, sort of largely drawn tropes, but I just connected with them, and it really, you know, I came to learn more and more over the years, especially when I was, you know, going into my teen years and, you know, early adulthood, that in RPGs, what I really care about is those characters. And that's really what sort of established for me the template, even more than like a Dragon Quest IV. And so just the way that it played, and like the fact that I was able to beat it on my own, and that I loved these characters, and these moments just felt so big and so large in my head as I was playing them. I was like, this is what I love. And so even when I'm playing something like Final Fantasy 14 now, one of the things that I love in that game is the spectacle of it. And you know, in 16, the spectacle, and there's so much spectacle, at least for a game at the time, in this game. And I just loved it. I've played it. I've played every different version of it to completion. And if they ever release another one, which who knows, I will be playing that one to completion as well, because I just adore this game, flaws and all.
Given their history, I'm sure they will put out another version of it soon enough.
Yeah, I'm currently I've not played this one. I'm currently working my way through the Pixel remasters. I feel I was really a massive gap in my knowledge. I'm really enjoying them. Um, but just to hear you talk about it, about number four in this way, Zach, makes me really excited to try it. Again, because of your praise of the narrative, which is so important to me. And I know there are quite a few other revolutions and new mechanics that this game introduces as well. Is that right?
ATB is introduced here.
Hmm.
Which is certainly a thing that follows through for a while. You know, and it's funny that you talk about the narrative, because if you play it, you're going to be like, well, this narrative's kind of silly, because it is. It's silly. But to me, when I was 7, I think when I played this game the first time, it was everything. It was
Mm.
like the pinnacle of all storytelling to me. But yeah, I mean, I think you'll still have a good time with it. Just don't take it too seriously.
Yeah, no, I'm very forgiving of some things from that period.
It's a simple story, but it's still a good story. I
Yeah.
mean, it's it's got some tropes, but it also came out before a lot of those a lot of other games were doing those tropes. You know, it was I mean, anime betrayals weren't a meme yet.
And there's like 17 of them in this one, so
It's true.
it's
Noble
fantastic.
sacrifices.
Yeah,
It's
like
it's got it
everything in the
all.
book. Yep. Yeah, it's
Big redemption arc.
yeah. Yeah, it works in the broad, but in a way that like I just adore, and I it's all nostalgia, but yeah, it made RPGs my genre. You know, when I was a kid, I played, you know, whatever was given to me, right? Like, oh, my grandparents have this game, I will play this game, even if it's like this Batman game that I can't even get past the first level of. I will play this game. Um, but yeah, this is the one that really sort of cemented it for me.
This is another one that Zach and I are sometimes almost the same person, except because this was also one that I had considered putting on my list. Um, not it's one of those weird corner cases where it's not even like you said my favorite Final Fantasy necessarily, but it's definitely the one I've spent the most time with. Um, and something where I've drilled down into the mechanics of it a lot in a way that I haven't in a lot of other games because
Well,
I
you do
played
like
the
crazy randomizer
randomizer.
stuff,
Yeah.
and yeah, you go wild with this game. I love it. I love watching those
Uh,
videos.
randomizers and ROM hacks both that are where you have to get into the nitty gritty with it, but so many weird little interactions with it and stuff like that that aren't in. I mean, I'm sure that earlier games have some cool like little corner case mechanics of their own as well. But like the more I play and learn about this about Final Fantasy IV, the more I enjoy the mechanics of it and the gameplay, even though it is relatively, I mean, you can pretty much just mash A through a good chunk of the game if you're leveled up enough and have the right equipment. But there's just a lot of neat stuff to it, and it definitely, especially if you are thinking about like what other games were around at the time, it does a lot of things that had not really been done a lot before, including like the cutscenes for like character dialogue and stuff like that. That and like the little cinematic camera pans. Uh, it's really simple. It's still on the little like tiny sprites, but just getting that little camera pan over to the other like across the screen as they're entering a new area or getting attacked or something like that is really cool.
And I could talk about this game for a while, but I won't. And I think that for kids from like the early '90s, like me, Final Fantasy was what got a lot of us into RPGs. But I think that if this was a thing when I was in high school, but I think if you were a little bit younger, the RPG franchise that I think really got people going is one of Lucas's. So, what's your next RPG that
Oh,
was formative for you, Lucas?
my next one is Pokemon, and I've specifically chosen the Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire version, which is not my first Pokemon, but definitely the one that I find the most influential. And actually, this kind of leads into some of the other stuff I was talking about with Final Fantasy as well. Because the reason I picked this is because this is the game that really got me into the mechanics of Pokemon for the first time. Because it started making a lot of that, like the competitive training and that sort of thing more accessible. Um, it is the last game that had the full national Pokedex. So it was like for me, that was like a big thing. They ran these events where they released all of the old mythicals and had like special events. So you'd have to like go to GameStop and get the little card to get certain ones or get a download code. Um, and I went out, I got every single event and filled out the full Pokedex, which I think at the time was like 800 and something. That was the first time since Gen 1 that I had done that. And, got into, you know, training out my Pokemon, really started thinking about like how natures and abilities and all of that worked. And I feel like that's something that led me into a lot of the stuff I do now with things like randomizers and ROM hacks. So I do the same thing with Pokemon games as well. And this is kind of the starting point of that for me was the Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire, the 3DS.
Yeah, the funny thing about that is that I'm just showing all my gaps today, really. But again, I haven't had a huge experience with Pokemon, but my this was the at least the 3DS version of it was the first Pokemon game that my son encountered, my oldest son, and therefore it was the first JRPG that he beat as well. And I know that he holds it in huge esteem to the extent that he not only once he beat it, he got a Switch later on, with loads of other games that he loves on it. But he went back to this afterwards to try and clear parts of it up, do the post game, etc. So I think that really is testament to its quality and staying power, if nothing else.
It has a huge post game. That was one of the big things. Like they just put in all kinds of little Easter eggs and little things where you can catch more Pokemon from other games. And I'm glad to hear that. I don't know how recently that was that he was playing it, but glad to hear that it's holding up.
Pretty recently, yeah, very recently, in
Yeah.
fact. Yeah, even yeah, even holding his attention over some of the more modern titles like Arceus. Um, so yeah, it's definitely got a lot of staying power.
Yeah, it's interesting, Lucas, that to hear such like a positive view of this game because personally, I was very disappointed with Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire as like a remake. My favorite, probably the peak of the series, Pokemon series for me is Heart Gold Soul Silver, which I thought are just amazing. It's Gen 2 is my favorite gen, and so I thought those remakes were excellent. And when these came out, like they're based on X and Y, which is where I kind of feel the series kind of downtrended. And there's no like there's it's missing a lot of the content from Emerald, like the Battle Frontier and things like that, which I remember at release I was like super disappointed that they didn't include those things. But it's really interesting to hear you talk about um, the elements that made you really love it, like the national decks and how it enabled you to get into like the more competitive and training side of Pokemon. I never really thought about it like that, but you're right that like it is really the last one where you had all the Pokemon at once at your fingertips, all in the same game, and you had like the full slate to kind of tinker around with, and that is like a huge. I know that's a huge thing for people, especially to get into competitive side. So it's like a new perspective on the game that I was kind of disappointed by. So it's really nice to hear.
For some reason, so I never played Emerald, which is probably part of it until recently. Um, and I actually missed some of those Gen 2, like the Gen 2 games back then. So that might be part of it as well. X and Y and Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire were where I really got back into it. I had a lot of friends that were playing it. I was playing it with, and like I said, the training side. I think this is also the first time they made it accessible, where they had like little graphs that actually showed you what your EVs
Mhm.
were and stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I think you're right too, just about that 3DS era of Pokemon is actually maybe the best in terms of like the multiplayer features, like making a lot of the Pokemon training, clear to you to the player, but also like they had the Wonder Trading. It was really easy to get online and play with other people and play against other people. And I feel like the Switch ones, they've kind of limited that some. And those games also have other problems. And so yeah, like I think you're right that the like multiplayer experience in particular probably is the strongest in the 3DS games and this one in particular, yeah.
I think that's it. It comes to the theme of the whole episode, doesn't it? Really about it's so interesting to hear both of your opinions on this, and yeah, the different things you think about it, because these games are very important in terms of when they hit us, what point in our lives we're at, what our experiences maybe with other titles in it, whereas somebody might who's been used to the series for a long time might be expecting something different. If this is your first one, it can be absolutely magical, as it was for my son. um so I think our list of choices definitely, I think, bears that out.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I mean, I think that's accurate for me. I've been on record as saying that I've never even played a single minute of a Pokemon game, which is weird for someone who likes RPGs as much as I do. But it to me, like the way that Lucas is describing it, I'm like, oh, that sounds like the Pokemon game that I want to play
Mm.
because like I want to get into those mechanics. I want to get into like the nitty gritty mechanics of stuff, which is over the years in my adult life has become like the thing that I appreciate more than anything. Because I hate to say this, but like I can watch like a great movie or I can like look at the story of an RPG, and a lot of times they're not working on the same level. And so I appreciate the mechanics of a game. So to me, that's maybe a good starting point for me. After watching my wife review Violet and the body horror that I witnessed and the just crimes against humanity that I saw on my TV graphically, that
Yeah.
maybe I need to try. I need to start somewhere else. But a game that doesn't look like crap It still looks beautiful to this day. Is one of Paul's picks. Man, I'm killing it with the transitions today. Yes,
I agree.
is
Yeah.
one of Paul's picks. I think it's one of the more beautiful games, musically and graphically, still today. So, Paul, talk to us about your next pick for a formative RPG.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Zach. It is beautiful, even now. And the thing that I'm talking about is something that I think many of our listeners will be familiar with, which is Secret of Mana. Also from the 90s, you're probably sensing a theme here. Um, I picked this up obviously on the Super Nintendo, um, which again for me was an absolute revelation after playing on the Spectrum in my early years. Yeah, at the time when I got the Super Nintendo, I was playing all the standard things that I guess the main body of people buying that console would be playing. So Mario Kart and Mario in general, and Street Fighter 2. Love that. Um, so I wasn't really in the JRPG or RPG sphere, but I went around my friend's house who also had a Super Nintendo, and he had this game, and he'd bought he was one of those kids that has everything, so irritating. He'd bought a multi-tap for it as well. So multi-tap was a device that you fitted to your Super Nintendo that allowed you to play with more than two people at a time. This really does sound like prehistory, doesn't it? It sounds like. Um, and he put this amazing Japanese game on. To start with, I had no idea what was going on. But soon, I got into it, and I was just brought again into this world of this boy, and later on girl and fairy, and just the this the gameplay itself of leveling up your weapons and the magic, and you're fighting your way through this fancy tech land. Again, that was a bit of a divergence for me as well, someone who wasn't used to other games like Final Fantasy that maybe people in different audiences would have been familiar with earlier than I was. But it was the ability to play with your friends that really made this game. Play with your friends, but not just play in something like Street Fighter, something where you're fighting each other and the game lasts like 2 minutes, but to go through this long, involved story together, supporting each other, not fighting each other. And to this day, I love kind of supportive, cooperative game. If you're going to play with your friends, couch co-op, I like that. Nothing to do with me being terrible at all those games and always getting beaten. Definitely not that. But yeah, that was where the true magic of Secret of Mana was, and that's before I'm sure the rest of you could talk about this much better than I. But it's before you even get into the beauty of the graphics and the amazing soundtrack, and everything else that we've praised so much over the years. But yeah, that was why this really was a moment for me. This was the point that JRPGs came into my life really in a big way, and changed my perspectives and led to the habits that would last a lifetime, I guess. So yeah, a really, really important title for me.
Much like Ben's experience with Omega Ruby being very different than mine, this is one of those where I really appreciate hearing your perspective on Secret of Mana because it is not one of my personal favorite games from that era. Uh,
Mm.
I I never really enjoyed it that much as far as the gameplay goes, but thinking about it from the perspective of, well, I know a lot of the RPG releases were limited for the UK,
Yep.
and also the I playing it with friends, that always makes an experience for a game so different because you have that memories associated with it. Maybe my experiences with Secret of Mana would have been different if I had a multi-tap.
Yeah, I do think that it really is a big part of it. To the extent that um I couldn't get hold of a UK copy of it actually, so I had to get a converter for my Super Nintendo, the thing you rammed into the top of it. so I could play the American release. I loved it that much. Um, but yeah, if I'd had to go through it just on my own, I think I totally agree with you because I'm not sure it would have had as big. I mean, still elements of it would still, of course, be resonant, the character design, etc. Um, but yeah, that single player experience really is trumped by the multiplayer, and it's kind of strange as well that it kind of forces you, doesn't it, to not play multiplayer at the beginning and to kind of hang around to wait a while. I know I tried the remake, and I tried that playing that a little bit with my wife, and we were like, "How long until until I can play now?" It's not. I don't think it's a design choice they go for now. Um, uh, but yeah, as I say, it's context again. Back then, there really wasn't anything like it.
It's funny because I love this game. I think that it's one of those games that if you didn't play it at the time and maybe you played like Second Densetsu 3 afterwards, you're like, oh,
Mm.
like this sim is just like objectively inferior to the next one. But I think there's something magical about Secret of Mana. I think that if my wife was on this podcast, she would probably put this on the list because she's similarly from the UK and similarly didn't have access to things. But I think it's just like the whole vibe of Secret of Mana to me is so specific and unique. And it's just like when I think of it, I just think of like lush greenery and this
Mm.
beautiful music, and like there is just like a particular feeling to Secret of Mana that maybe is driven by my nostalgia. We somewhat infamously at this point at RPG Fan give it a retro review, which I know Lucas is familiar with because he works in the social media team,
Oh my
where we
god.
gave it a 65, and I could see coming at it from that angle, but to me, like this is such a part of my childhood, and I didn't even like I played. I didn't really play co-op with my family growing up. We would pass controllers back and forth, like
Mm.
I get an hour, you get an hour, I get an hour, you get an hour. So that experience wasn't really the same for me. I didn't play it with anyone else, but yeah, I think that it's just like to me, it's like such a specific moment in time that this easily could have landed on my list.
So yeah, I have played Secret of Mana. My first experience with the Mana series is actually Sword of Mana, which is kind of interesting because it's a reimagining of the first like Final Fantasy adventure, but with more of the mechanics from Secret of Mana.
Mm.
And like I have since, and I really love that game, even though I know that's another game that like a lot of people aren't fond of, but I think just because of the time that I played it and it'd be my first experience with Mana that it was a really, big deal for me. And then I have since gone back and played, Secret of Mana and Trials of Mana and Final Fantasy Adventure. And I really like Secret of Mana. I mean, I think for me, as far as like the Mana series goes, it's more in the middle. Like I think it mechanically, it's not as interesting as Trials of Mana. And I think it doesn't kind of have that the simple charm that like Final Fantasy Adventure has, and I think Mana is like one of those series where it's like the aesthetics and the music and all that are really really strong, but then the gameplay doesn't really quite match up, and I think they really nailed that with Visions, which I think is really great, one of the best games last year. But I think none of that would have happened. Like I don't think I would have played any of those games, and none of those games would have existed without Secret of Mana being so popular and kind of establishing the franchise overseas too. So in that sense, like it's a super super important game, and I respect it a lot for that, even if it's not one of my favorites.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear you say that. I'd really love to continue the journey and give Trials a go and give Visions a go. The thing that put me up, I suppose, was the lack of multiplayer
Mhm.
in the modern version of that and in Visions, um, which coming at Secret as it did was, as I've said so far, was the key defining feature of it. So for that not to be there for those future titles has meant they haven't jumped right to the top of the main list, even though they look beautiful, particularly Visions. It's great to hear you say that you like it, Bennett. Maybe I should be bumping that up, especially given my history with the series as well.
So I felt pretty proud of my transitions until now. I'm gonna not feel so proud of this next one. So speaking of action RPGs, Ben, go ahead and talk about the next RPG that was formative for you.
Yeah, so my next RPG is one called Xanadu Next. So this is a um, action RPG originally developed for the PC that released in 2005 in Japan, and then was brought over much later in 2016, I believe, to the West by Xseed, and it was developed by Falcom, who are probably better known for Ease and the Legend of Heroes Trails series. And the reason why I put this on the list is because this is really where my love for Falcom as a developer kind of was formed. Playing this game really kind of opened my eyes, I think, to how unique, especially some of their older games are, and how influential that I think they are as a developer, especially one that has been around for so long and been making RPGs for so long. So Xanadu Next is it is very much a classic kind of dungeon crawler action RPG, somewhat in the vein of Diablo. It has a similar presentation style. You have that isometric, presentation, and originally it was designed for total mouse control, so moving with the cursor and then using the keyboard to use your abilities and all that. Very similar to the setup of Diablo. But it kind of has some elements more of other Japanese games mixed in there with the kind of Diablo action RPG framework. So you've got a little bit of puzzle solving that's a lot more similar to what you'd find in the Legend of Zelda series, particularly the like classic top-down Zeldas. And then you have bits and pieces from other games kind of mixed in together. So the basic premise is you're this knight who was part of this group called the Chevaliers, and they were basically falsely accused of some causing some political instability and disgraced. And so, as part of that, he's kind of on the run and is accompanying his childhood friend who is a archaeologist to this island. And on this island is this old castle called Castle Strange Rock. And so she is interested in investigating kind of the history of the island. And so you accompany her as protection, and then you end up doing most of the looking for artifacts for her and bringing them back to her for her to kind of translate. Which is a really interesting premise. There's not really a lot of like upfront storytelling, but um, through uncovering those artifacts, you get a lot of background in the world. And then there's also a lot of other characters that are converging upon this particular island for their own purposes that you kind of meet along the way. And it's just a really, really interesting game. Mechanically, it's very unique. You have kind of like Final Fantasy Tactics Advance or Final Fantasy IX. You have this ability system that's tied to equipment or to weapons. So using a weapon, once you gain like proficiency with that weapon, then you get to you permanently learn whatever skills associated with it. And so a lot of those skills, some of them are attack skills, some of them are passive skills. And that's like a really interesting thing that keeps equipment meaningful throughout the game, even equipment that might be less powerful. If it has a really good skill, then you might want to use it. There's also this guardian system where as you explore the dungeons on the island, you find these guardian spirits, and then you can assign those to your character, and those present passive bonuses to you. So increase your health, increase your magic ability. But then some of them are a lot more interesting and unique in terms of the abilities they convey. And then through that, you have like a traditional like stat allocation system, like you would in like traditional dungeon crawler. So you can kind of tailor your character to different builds, which is really interesting. And it just has a lot of really unique elements like that. that make it interesting. It has a really kind of dark and foreboding atmosphere, which suits the setting really well. And it also has a really eclectic soundtrack that's different than any of Falcom's other soundtracks. They're really known for like the kind of heavy rock soundtracks and like Ease or Trails. But this game really has a lot more atmospheric and kind of somber music to it. But it's all really, really good. Uh, so yeah, I mean, it's kind of something that straddles a lot of different genre lines, but um, you know, I think that's what makes it so appealing to me. And yeah, like the influence that I think it's had on the genre as a whole, even though it's not a well known game here in the West, I think is huge.
Of all the games that I had to research a little bit, because I've heard of this game, but I hadn't, I didn't know a lot about it. Of all the games that I researched, I was like, this is the game that seems like my jam. And like looking around online, I see a lot of people comparing it, and I hate to make this comparison because everyone hates this comparison, but it's the truth. That it has a little souls in it in terms of the
Yes,
exploration. That you've got
yes,
like the ability to sort of, especially Dark Souls 1, the ability to find different, ways to get different spaces, and like the atmosphere. Like as I was watching like gameplay videos of it, I was like, wow, like this, like the music and the vibe, like it feels a little oppressive. um
yeah.
and that seems like my jam.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Zach, because I am convinced that some of the developers at From Software played this game before making Dark Souls, because the like world design of the kind of dungeons and how they're interlinked and connect to the hub is so much like Firelink Shrine. Like there's like the like even like you take an elevator down and then you get back to the hub. Like there's no
Oh,
way.
that's literally this
Yeah.
Dark Souls 1. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And this came out in like 2005, so well before. So I think that they definitely like there's definitely a direct influence between the two. Even though I've never found any like interview or anything that says that, I'm convinced that they're directly related, at least in that way.
I mentioned when we were kind of doing the preamble for the show that this is one that have installed on Steam and apparently played about 15 minutes and then bounced off of. Hearing you talk about it, I am definitely going to be reinstalling this after we're done with the call and giving it another shot, because this definitely sounds like a uh, really interesting game. I like the idea with the weapons that you mentioned. Diablo clones have always been one of my kind of go-to comfort games, and finding interesting ones is always tricky. And that kind of world setting, I'm definitely interested in learning more about. That kind of atmospherics with this like residual storytelling where you're just getting like little lore drops. Sounds
Hmm.
really fun.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's the strength of this game too, compared to some of Falcom's other games. Is like most of their games are in these really long running series, and a lot of them have like narrative connections to one another. And this game doesn't have any of that baggage, so you don't have to know anything about any other Xanadu games or any other games that they've made.
Thank God.
Yeah, you could just come in completely fresh and play this game, and it's a fully contained story, and totally unique mechanics and everything. You don't need to know anything about any of their other games.
It's a
So that
pretty
makes it
short game
really.
too, isn't it?
Hmm?
It's a
Oh,
pretty
short?
short game
Yeah,
too, isn't it? Yeah.
yeah. It's like 20 hours, I would say.
Hmm.
So yeah, compared to their other games, way shorter. Yeah, it puts it around in line with like an ease game, I guess, the older ease games. But yeah, yeah, it's not a huge time commitment at all.
It's great that you've brought this, Ben, because I would consider myself now to be a fairly big Falcon fan, even though I am still just slowly making my way through those big interconnected Trails at Ease series that you mentioned already, which do require those the commitment and the interlocking plot lines, etc. Um, but as you say, that's I've only had the experience with those to experience something outside of that. And I've been interested by Tokyo Xanadu, which I think is the latest one in this particular unconnected series. It's fascinating to hear about something from further back in their history, and it definitely um, Yeah, as has been said already, that definitely sounds up my street. The kind of darker elements to it, which we don't get quite as much, or as much as I'd like, I suppose, in JRPGs. So yeah, you've definitely sold me on this one.
Yeah, it's I think it takes a lot of elements from both like Japanese role playing games and more Western role playing games and kind of
Mm.
fuses those in together in a really interesting way. So I think it would appeal really to fans of any type of RPG. I think could find something to like in it for sure.
Speaking of fusing different types of gameplay together. Oh man, that's rough. Anyway,
That's a good one,
I
Zach, because
like
I
it.
know what
I
you're gonna
like
talk
it.
about, and it's very yeah.
The next game is a game that I hesitated to bring because first of all, it is by far, at least of the games we've talked about so far, the most modern. Came out in 2017. But I probably said the year, and like some of you are like groaning, like you know what I'm about to say. And that is Nier Automata is a formative game for me, and it's strange for me to talk about a game being formative that came out when I was in my 30s, but it is formative for me. And I'm not going to go on and on about Nier Automata. I certainly could and have and will again, but I want to talk about sort of where it came in my life. So I was a huge RPG player growing up. And that was like what I did. And then when I got to like late high school, like I just didn't have, I don't know, the inclination. I really honestly didn't have the time. I was busier when I was in high school than I have been in my whole life. And then when I got to college, like all my friends were playing Halo, and I got into like the Melee tournament scene. And then like I started as a teacher, and like anyone who has ever been a teacher knows early in your career as a teacher, like you don't really have time for much of anything beyond doing that. And I was sort of going through some weird transitional moments in my life, but I was still reading RPG fan, and I was still playing RPGs here and there. But I interestingly, my wife Alana wrote a review for Nier Automata, and I read it. And this is before I ever spoken to Alana, and I was like, "Man, I got to play that game." So I went to go buy a PS4, and I played Nier Automata. Was the very first game I played on that PlayStation 4, and Nier Automata has changed the way that I see video games, what video games are capable of, what they can do. I've played it to completion 3 times, and all 3 times have been at very particular moments in my life. And then when I get to ending E, and if you've played it, you know, it's like really struck this chord in me about like where I was in my life and where I wanted to go in my life. But I think maybe most importantly, for the sake of this, like it mixes like every single piece and part gets to the whole. Like the gameplay, like when you're playing as 2B in the first route, like you could pretty much just mow things down. And that's like part of the point, because in the next route, you're playing as 9S and the game gets harder because he's not combat ready. And even the way that saving works in the game, like all of it works together to create a thematic whole that it just crescendos into that final ending, where it's a mix of gameplay and narrative, and the way that it tells its narrative through gameplay in a way that I do not think has been matched before or since. The only game that I've played in the last 8 years that I think even comes close to it is not working on the same level narrative or gameplay wise, which is 1,000 times Resist, which I think is a brilliant game, which everybody should play. But I think that it has taught me that games can reach higher. And it is also in some ways put me in a position where I'm disappointed by so many games because they don't reach higher. And I don't know. Nier Automata to me is the pinnacle of the genre. It's not my favorite game because nostalgia says Suikoden 2 is, but it is, in my opinion, the best game ever made. And it has set like this bar that is unmatched for me. And maybe that's even nostalgia at this point to my early 30s. But Nier Automata is a very important game to me and has really changed the way that I see the medium.
So you're saying it's quite good then, Zach?
Yeah, hyperbole, maybe. I don't know, man. I believe it all.
I was just gonna say, I think it's good that you brought this one up, Zach, because I think like Yoko Taro, I think is such a visionary, and I think his games are everyone who's into RPGs or or games as a storytelling or narrative medium should play his games. And I think Nier Automata is really the most accessible of the games that he's created. It's the one with the, it has the least amount of obstacles and roadblocks to actually getting into it, because the gameplay is just it's a little more fine tuned. It doesn't have maybe some of the more interesting quirks that some of his other games have, but it is just so much easier to get into, and it is so engaging in the storytelling and the creation of the setting, the world, that um, it's so easy to recommend. And I think once someone's played it, then they'll have this hunger to go back and play his other work. And I think that's maybe the most
Draken
important thing.
card coming soon to Retro
Yes.
Encounter.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so excited for that. But yeah, I mean, I think once Automata is a great introduction to Yoko Taro, and then you're over willing to look some of the rougher elements of his other games once you've been kind of shown his brilliance through a game that's a lot more approachable. And Automata does that, and I think that's the best thing about it.
Yeah, I think for me, this is my biggest mission in terms of things I haven't got to yet, because I did play the Replicant remake all the way through, got all the different endings for it, and if maybe not to the same extent as Zach with Automata, it was again a revelatory experience. It's so different. The atmosphere, the feeling, the tone. Some might say in some parts a disrespect for your time with the side quests, but that you're willing to put up with. You're willing to put up with it. And just everything that you said, Zach, really, again, hearing somebody speak so eloquently about it makes me know that this really should be a priority for me going forwards. As you say, Yoko Taro does seem to have something a little bit different, a little bit special, um, that's not easily replicatable. And this time and time again, this comes up as a crucial title, so I can see why you've picked it.
Well, Paul, it's great that you've already played the first Nier, so now
Yeah.
you're perfectly set up to have an excellent
yeah.
experience with Automata.
Yeah, I mean, Replicant is certainly has fewer barriers than the original Nier, but I mean, I love Nier Replicant too. Like it's that new ending they added, I think is just genius. Yeah, so I'm glad you got to experience it.
I find it interesting that you were talking about the bar that it sets and the I guess hyperbole, maybe not, of the the discussions that have been had around about it uh on this podcast, for sure, and on RPG Fan in general, because I have not played this game, and I think part of the reason why is because I keep putting it off, waiting for like the perfect time to play it, because the bar has been set, like my expectations have been set so high from the Retro Encounter podcast, from Alana's article that I has probably been my most reshared RPG Fan article at this point.
Yes, the one about the queer issues.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Obviously, I think so.
And I don't know. I own it. I just have not gotten around to actually sitting down and playing it because, and I think, like I said, it's just really, I want to sit down and actually focus in and enjoy it. And so often when I'm gaming, I'm multitasking a little bit, and
Yeah.
I don't really have the time to dedicate.
I mean,
And I
the
feel
thing I will
like it
say,
deserves that dedication.
yeah, and I agree with that. I mean, the thing that I will say about it is that it takes a while to get going. I'm not saying that the beginning is bad by any means, but like when you start playing it, you're gonna be like, oh, it's like robots, not as bad as we think. Blah 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 blah. So like it takes a minute to get its hooks into you, and I think in some ways that actually might work to your benefit. And it's also like funnier and goofier than like probably you think based on the conversations about it. It's like I don't know, like I feel like when I have to watch like a great movie, I'm like, okay, I have to like pay attention. Like I'm watching, I don't know, Fellini's 8.5. I must like be in the right headspace for it. And I watched it, I'm like, oh, this is actually just pretty fun. So I'll just encourage you to Just give it a
That
shot and
actually,
see how you feel.
yeah, that actually does help a little bit, knowing that all of the stuff has indicated that it, because it does have those serious themes that it touches on.
Yeah.
So it's really good to hear that it has that humor and stuff as well, that
Oh, for sure.
Yeah,
the fun aspects.
it's not pretentious at all. I mean, I think that's the thing. People who haven't played it and see a lot of the discourse around it might get the idea, but it is very much like a video game, like capital V, capital G video game. And it is very enamored with being a video game, and so it doesn't take itself too seriously, and it really is not. I think anyone who appreciates video games as a medium will get something out of it. And you don't have to be like, a scholar or like what. It's not there's a little bit of highbrow, but there's a lot of lowbrow to
Oh
it
yeah, I
too.
mean, Yoko Taro's got some lowbrow to him. Maybe to the point where occasionally I'm like, "You gave me a trophy for that in your replicant." If you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
No.
He's a goofy dude.
The
Yep.
game, yeah, it doesn't think it's better than you. So
Yeah,
it's
that's a good way
very
of putting it.
approachable. Yeah.
I think, although I've not played it, I think I've listened to the soundtrack a million
Oh
times.
my goodness.
And if I think that I put that probably as a formative moment for me again, at an older age, but just the possibilities and potentials of video game music really just pushed all the way up to 11, to use an old cliche, with that album. Um, yeah, truly amazing. And again, that combined with Zach's thoughts here really, makes me think this is something I should have done already, and I will do it very soon.
Yeah, I hate to make it sound like homework, but it's because I'm very good at doing, because teacher here. But that's a game that we have talked about a lot on Retro Encounter. But let's talk about some games that I know we haven't really talked about much. One of the games, mine, we definitely have at least mentioned. But let's talk about the game that I hadn't even heard of before we started recording, and it's Lucas's game. So we're going to talk about non-RPGs that are formative for us. And Lucas brought a game that is by a creator who is significant, but I had never heard of before. So talk about your non-RPG game, Lucas.
So the game I'm bringing for this is called An Untitled Story. This is a freeware game that was created by Maddie Thorson, who is best known as one of the creators of Celeste, part of the studio that was, up until very recently and slightly disappointingly, working on Earthblade. That just got canceled. Um, and I An Untitled Story is an indie Metroidvania that was made by one person. It has basically MS Paint backgrounds and graphics. It is part of the reason I brought it was literally because it is a game that is not one that I think most people have heard of, that still is really good and kind of out of the way, better than it has any right to be. Because I tend to like those type of games. I have a tendency to have that little bit of gamer hipsterness of, oh, you've probably never heard of that game. And this was kind of the era where I started exploring those with games like Cave Story and Spelunky and An Untitled Story. Um, yeah, and eventually this led me into, following into a lot of the indie scene with like actually, like, most of my social media follows at this point are uh the Celeste team and Derek Yu and some of these other like indie creators from that era. Because and they've led me to a lot of interesting games that I wouldn't have found otherwise, because that community is so interknit and so good about supporting up and coming and new creators that um, that I wouldn't have heard of otherwise. And I encourage everybody to take a look at this, even if you don't play it, because it is hard. It is, a mid 2000s indie game, which, but I feel
I
like
just
this
always think
one's,
of I Wanna Be the Guy, which is the
yeah,
most brutal game I've ever played in my life.
this is more so. A lot of Maddie's other games are closer to that around that time, like Jumper and An Untitled Story. If you play it on the hard difficulty, is that hard? But it does have lower difficulty levels, and as long as you are not trying to 100% it, it is relatively approachable. Um, the big pieces that make it hard are it has like some items that are gated. You have to go through a section without getting hit in order to open certain gates. And I think those hitless sections are the only thing that are like absolutely a deal breaker as far as difficulty goes for most people.
Yeah. Now you were talking when you said lower difficulty levels, you're talking about language. That's for sure. I love that you've brought something really left. I've never heard of this. I've obviously heard of Celeste, but never heard of this before. And I think these little smaller indie titles are really what breathe life into just video gaming as a whole, let alone the titles that we look at. So I really appreciate you doing that. Whether or not, as I said, if there's a gated moment that relies on extreme skill, then that's going to be the end of my gameplay with that game, I would imagine, at that point. But from what you're saying, it sounds like there's a lot of value to this anyway. Do you think we should give it a try, even if we're not the hardcore Metroidvania type people?
I I don't know if I'd go that far, but if you are a fan of Metroidvanias, I'll say it's a good artifact in that
Yeah,
genre.
yeah.
And as I was preparing for this episode, I realized I hadn't really thought about before that in with this coming out in 2007, this is before a lot of the Metroidvanias that we think of as the big indie Metroidvania scene. Like,
Yeah, for
obviously, there
sure.
were things like I mentioned, Cave Story came out before this. I think La Mulana came out before this, but those are like the big ones that came out before this one, and both of those are not very traditional.
Hmm.
Whereas this one has a lot of the more like you know a lot of the more familiar elements. I think like the double jump and as an early item and the um the different like grapple capabilities and stuff that you tend to get um where I can see this game's influence on other games even if it is not a game that people know, if that makes sense.
No, I mean, it makes sense to me, and it's, I know this developer, of course. I played through the first 4 chapters of Celeste, and we'll talk about this in a moment. I appreciate difficulty in games. It's like a thing that I'm attracted to nowadays, but not platforming difficulty, because I'm bad at that. But, so Celeste, I was like, I love this. I love the vibe. I love the message, like, especially once you really know the whole story behind Celeste, like, this is a stunner. Um, but like when I was watching videos of this game to prepare for the podcast, I was like, oh, this is the kind of game I want to play. Like you guys have brought so many games that like, oh, I've never played that except for you, Paul. I don't want to play either the whole thing.
Oh no! How dare you?
How dare I? But like so many of you have brought games that I really want to check out, and this one just looks really weird and kind of hard and also really weird and like I want to play it.
That is a great description of it.
Lucas, have you ever heard of a game called Knit or like Knit Stories or
Yes.
Knit?
Yep.
Oh, okay. See, that's a freeware game from that era that I have played, but this reminds me, hearing you talk about it reminds me a lot of that game.
It is very similar to some of the later Knit games. Knit, the first Knit doesn't have the actual Metroidvania elements. It's just the exploration. But you don't like get new abilities as you go.
Hmm.
But I think the later Knit games were definitely in a similar space to this, um, and have a lot of similar DNA. Yes.
Yeah, that makes me really interested. I think I'm gonna have to go back and play this. Is it? Can you just like still download it or?
Yep. It's still up on the Maddie Makes Games website.
Well, Speaking of Metroidvanias, that's an easy one. But also a game that I know Lucas only didn't pick because he knew I was going to pick it.
It's true.
Yeah. So for my non-RPG, I'm going to go basic here. I feel like all my picks have been like basic, like Final Fantasy IV, Nier Automata, and now Hollow Knight. And obviously, Hollow Knight's brilliance has been litigated, for almost a decade now. So I won't get too much into why it's obviously an amazing game, one of my absolute favorite games. But for me, it's become extremely formative for what I value in a game. So, like, I talked earlier about like Nier Automata showed me what a video game can do from a storytelling perspective. And I get increasingly frustrated almost every year that video games don't really try to do that. Whereas Hollow Knight showed me like what I appreciate from a gameplay perspective. So Hollow Knight's storytelling is very sort of, under the surface, but it's all about vibes. It's all about mood. And I just love the mood that is established from it, the loneliness of it that is established. And I love the exploration of it. And before I played Hollow Knight, I played a few Metroidvanias, but I didn't always appreciate them. I thought that the backtracking was sometimes frustrating. I thought that sometimes like you would give me like 7 things I could do in a certain room, but I couldn't do any of them yet, and that I couldn't remember what I was supposed to do, and it frustrated me. But Hollow Knight, like the exploration is so non-linear, and there are so many different ways and places you can go, and the mood of it and the music of it is just stunning. But really, the thing that to me defines my Hollow Knight experience is the most hardcore element of it. Like I remember when my wife was describing the sort of the end game to get like the quote unquote true ending. I was like, I will never do that before I played Hollow Knight, and then I did it. And then I did all the pantheons, and like there's a boss rush at the end of 46, I believe. That's actually it's 42, I think 42 or 43 bosses in a row, and then the boss at the end is a souped up version of the final boss. And I was banging my head against it. And then the best feeling I think I've ever had playing a video game was when I beat Absolute Radiance at the top of P5. It was just like I like threw up my hands. I took a videotape of it. It was just incredible. And then I went back and I fought every boss on Radiant, which means you have to beat them all hitless. And while that is in no way a brag, but it taught me something about myself that like I like the friction, I like the difficulty, I like something where like I have to push myself against it again and again and again. And so after that, pretty shortly, I played Bloodborne, which I've played 15 times at this point. Sekiro, Soulsborne games. Like I choose hard difficulties on games because I think in a lot of ways, hard difficulty sort of forces you to engage with the mechanics. It's sort of like Lucas doing his randomizers and things like that. It forces me to engage with the mechanics. And so like I love having to understand what the mechanics of a thing are and like get to the bottom of them and then execute them. And so like to me above anything, above all the brilliance of Hollow Knight, the thing that it taught me is that like I like hard. I like difficult, I like challenge, and I like the feeling I get when I overcome those challenges. And that might sound like a get good douchebag thing to say, but it's not really true. Like I don't judge anyone who doesn't feel that way. But for me, I do feel that way, and I love it.
As long as it's not platform.
As long as it's not platforming. I'm not good at those.
That is the thing that I find the most interesting as kind of a difference there, because I love, like, you mentioned you hadn't done Path of Pain and hadn't done, like, I wasn't, I'm very surprised to hear that you
That
have
Path of
done
Pain is
all
the
of them.
only thing I have not done in Hollow Knight.
And that's something that I did, but I have not done all the Pantheon stuff. And that's something, like, the boss fights are something that I need to, now that I have had more experience with things, because when I beat Hollow Knight, I immediately, like, I didn't go back and get everything as much as I feel like I would now, because I was immediately like, oh, I'm gonna go play Ori and Guacamelee and all these other games that are that had come out around that same time and that had come out shortly after it. And I mean, it sparked me into that genre, but I never went back and actually 100%ed Hollow Knight the way that I have a lot of other games since.
I mean, you could do it before Silksong comes out. You have like 5 years, so
Silksong's gonna come out.
maybe. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, it's funny that you say that because like the first 3 games I played this year were Metroidvanias, but they are all like combat driven ones. Like Nine Souls, I beat like early January. Amazing. It's really barely a Metroidvania. It's like a side scrolling action game. But
Right.
then I played Ender Lilies and Ender Magnolia, which I know you're playing on YouTube right now, Lucas.
Yes.
And Ender Magnolia in particular, I really, really loved. Like Lilies, I thought sometimes like the mechanic, it was a beautiful game. Like, oh, the music, the vibes, beautiful. But like Magnolia, I'm like, oh, this is a refined version of that. It's really fun. So like I like combat driven Metroidvanias a lot nowadays. And I 100% of both of those games. So I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, I had a different experience with Hollow Knight in that I did not finish it. I did not get to the end because I am not a natural, as I mentioned earlier on, difficult games person. But I can still see exactly what you're saying, Zach. It is beautiful to play. Um, it has that unique visual style. It was so popular in this household that we bought a massive banner for one of the rooms here. So it had an impact generally upon myself and all of us, even if I haven't got to the end. And it does make me feel like, from hearing both of you talk there, that I should at some point go back to it and try and tough it out to the end. Um, because I agree. There's so much. It certainly had an impact on me when I did. What I have played of it so far.
I have obviously 100% at Hollow Knight, or 112% it, I believe is what the actual term is nowadays. But a series that I have never been able to beat, because like I've never been able to beat any games in the series because like I'm bad at them. And actually that's not true. I co-opt through like Resident Evil 5 at some point, I think. By like couch co-op, you just pass the controller back and forth. But like I've always been bad at Resident Evil games, but apparently Paul isn't. So talk to us about Resident Evil 2.
Yeah, this kind of contradicts my theme, whilst at the same time supporting it in a strange way, as to why this game was so impactful for me and why it had such a significant change to my life. It wasn't the first Resident Evil game that I played. The first one was Resident Evil Director's Cut, which was the slightly different version of that first game that was released for the PS1. But it was so hard, and it's so brutal that it kind of put me off of it. And my memory doesn't serve me whether I ever actually finished it. I know I finished the remake, the Resident Evil 1 remake, which is great. I would recommend anyone play that. But then Resident Evil 2 came out, and my history outside of fantasy literature and things is I'm a huge fan of science fiction, horror, zombie horror, all that kind of stuff. So this was really hitting those narrative desires, whilst at the same time it was taking that brutal Resident Evil formula and just introducing a little bit of more of an action bent. Not to the extent that it would become later. So it's still tough. It's still survival horror. But it just tipped the scales ever so slightly, to which I became naturally enraptured with it. Now, for those who don't know, it starts off with a zombie outbreak. Probably most people do know by now, but it escalates the scale where the first game was set in a zombie outbreak within a mansion. This one is within an entire city. And at the time, when it came out, just the scale of the opening, with everything on fire, and you race towards a police station, a hideout in a seemingly safe refuge, which of course we find out is not at all. And then you're just thrown into this escalating world of danger, where every moment feels like it's as bad as it's going to get, but of course it isn't. And I would still say that even though I absolutely love the remake from recent years, this one did certain moments better. Like it introduces this creature called a licker, which is basically skinless crawling zombie with a giant tongue. And the way it introduces it, and it's like tiny little cutscene as you go around a corner, is like horrifying, and really, it made you concerned whether, as you say, whether you could get through it at all. But if you did make it through, you were greeted with some just fantastic movie-like moments. And yeah, we would say now is this, particularly for then as opposed to the remake, is the script brilliant? No. Is the voice acting great? Definitely no. But the strength of everything around it, and relying on those tropes, like aliens in particular as a trope. Towards the end, it flips into aliens territory as you find yourself in a secret underground laboratory beneath the police station, and containing probably my favorite moment in the whole thing, which is you're going down in a lift, and then there's like an emergency countdown going on as well. Everything is just absolutely furiously going on around you. And then the game finishes, and then you have to play it again, which was, again, a big surprise and not something I was used to. It did it in a way that it's strange they kept it with the remake as well. It did it in a very strange way in that the second route, there's two main characters, one Leon, one Claire. In the second route, you play the person that you didn't pick the first time around. Some things, they have a different plot, but some things stay the same. So it's a little strange. But if you do manage to finish it a second time, you get the actual true ending, which was well worth doing and still is in the modern version of it. And yeah, as I said, this introduced me to action gaming that I had not thought that I could get on with previously, and it did encourage me to pursue, even though there is the sort of sense of difficulty that you were talking about earlier on, Zach. Even though now I try and go back to Resident Evil games, I find it more difficult. I don't know whether or not it's because I've gotten a little bit older and now I can't quite take the jump scares as much as I could before. But I still find myself thinking back to this game because there was something special about that blend of like schlock horror and other genres that and the continuing and the start of the or the early days of the continuing storyline of Resident Evil that some of the modern titles I don't think have quite captured in the same way.
Paul, I was so glad to see that you put this on your list. I had debated putting Silent Hill 2 on mine, but I wanted to kind of represent a little, something different with my non-RPG pick. And then I saw that you added Resident Evil 2, and I was like, oh, good. We've got survival horror. We're good. I think you've done a really great job like laying out how important this game was. I mean, I think really like Resident Evil 1 is a super important game and super formative for the genre, but I think Resident Evil 2 is really what establishes the core elements of Resident Evil that you would define like the series after that. Like every game in the series since 2 owes so much to what Resident Evil 2 did. And you mentioned like how that there's some strengths to the original over the remake, and I agree. I think particularly having that limited perspective of the pre-rendered backgrounds and the fixed camera angles definitely kind of adds to the like horror and vulnerability that you feel as a player. And like you're talking about like the lickers, for example, like if the lickers on the ceiling, you can't necessarily even see them, right? So like there's so many ways which they play with your perspective, and having that controlled um fixed perspective is so valuable. And I think in some ways like modern horror games have kind of lost that to a certain extent. And that I think is something that I really appreciate about the early Resident Evil games, and 2 in particular.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, they ramped up the action side even more, of course, notoriously for Resident Evil 4, which is still a great game. But I think you're correct there in saying that direction, and that influence has strayed into many modern horror, survival horror, modern horror in general, and it does. Yeah, perhaps it opens it up a little bit more to a broader audience, but it does take a little bit away from it. I would agree with you completely on that. And it's funny that you talk about you mentioned it's a similar thing with Silent Hill 2 as well. Silent Hill 2, Silent Hill in general. That lack of control,
Hmm.
the things being slightly um slightly beyond vision, slightly beyond sight, really creates an experience that you don't it's difficult to find nowadays.
Yeah, yeah, and there's so much that you can do with that. That just the mere suggestion of something around the corner or behind the door that is so powerful compared to just showing you that. And I think some of these modern remakes kind of miss that. And even though I would say Silent Hill for me is above Resident Evil in terms of like horror series, but Silent Hill owes so much to what Capcom did with Resident Evil. There would be no you know Silent Hill series without what Capcom established, especially with Resident Evil 1 and then Resident Evil 2. So Resident Evil 2 is such an important game for the horror genre. Just like established so much that pretty much every horror game after would take from it. It's hugely influential.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that for me, Silent Hill, the series, is more important in terms of the sheer art of video games, let alone horror video games. But um, Resident Evil 2 um, introduced things for me that I hadn't seen in other video games, like the recurring villain of both it. So you have a
Yeah.
scientist called William Birkin who injects himself with his self-created virus, turning him into a raging monster, motivated by trying to um, get his daughter back for some reason. And he keeps appearing throughout the game, changing, getting more mutated and horrific as he goes along, but still having that vestige of humanity with him, which I think is one of the scariest things of all. It's that kind of body horror aesthetic, isn't it? But and also the other recurring villain, who only comes in the second scenario in the original version. In the remake they did later on, again, maybe I'm not so keen on this. He appears in both scenarios, maybe
Hmm.
detracting a little bit. This is the it's Mr. X, isn't it? I can't remember.
Yes, Mr.
Mr.
X. Yep.
X. I'm just trying to remember the name. Yeah, Mr. X, a kind of suit trench coat wearing,
Hmm.
behatted, like 8 foot tall monstrosity that cannot be stopped. You could slow it down a little bit, but you can never get rid of it. Um, and again, just at moments of the game, you'll think everything will be quiet, and then suddenly it'll just crash through a wall after you. I've often found that kind of thing frustrating. I'm like, just die already. I like to be able to clear a room and then it's gone and it's done. So it speaks to the strength of the game that actually that became one of the big motivating factors to finally see if I can make my way to the end and get rid of this absolute tool.
Yeah, and having that
uh,
pursuer enemy, I mean, that's so influential for so many horror games after, right?
mm,
Like you've got Pyramid Head and Silent Hill 2, you
yeah.
have Nemesis and Resident Evil 3, and Capcom would even iterate on that with Haunting Ground later, right? So
Mm.
in other games had done it before, but the way it's done in Resident Evil 2, I think is like what really popularized it and kind of established it as like that core element of like horror games for sure.
Yeah, basically becomes Terminator the game, and I love it.
Mhm.
I love that.
Yeah, Resident Evil 2 is a game that is the remake is sitting on my shelf, and I'm like, I'm gonna play that, and I haven't. But this is helping to convince me. I will say that like when I was looking at the list of games, I was like, oh, Resident Evil 2's on there. That makes sense for somebody. But I was a little surprised to see a game that I quite enjoyed when it came out. But I was like, why this game? And then I read about it and like, oh, I understand now. But Ben, your last game surprised me. So what is our final game? We're talking about a non-RPG that had an influence on you.
Yeah, so that game is Ridge Racer Type 4. I'm there's not a whole lot of room to really show this on RPG Fan all the time, but I'm a huge fan of racing games. And for me, the kind of defining era of racing games that really made me fall in love with the genre is the PS1 era. And in particular, I think Ridge Racer Type 4 is like the pinnacle of that era of racing games, particularly like arcade style racing games. Some people say Gran Turismo, and if you're really into simulation style racers, obviously that is like the kind of the preeminent example of that. But for me, arcade style is what I prefer, and Ridge Racer Type 4 is just so good. And what makes it good is that it kind of has it's really represents like Namco at the peak of their powers, the combination of them, and the golden age of their arcade development, and then when they really embraced console gaming and kind of fusing those two things together. And you have this really great visual audio visual experience with between the menus and like the yellow color scheme, and has that kind of Y2K like computer aesthetic to all the menus, but it's really flashy and slick. And the soundtrack is so good. It's like this jazzy kind of like techno soundtrack. If you've never heard the soundtrack of Ridge Racer Type 4, please look it up. It is excellent. Probably one of the best OSTs, I think, on the PlayStation, but maybe even of all time. And that's high praise because the PlayStation has so many good soundtracks. Such a defining era for video game music. But really, what makes Ridge Racer work, I think, is its simplicity. So it's a very simple racing game. Um, it's all based around this drifting mechanic where you're always like accelerating, and you want to kind of the courses are really well designed. They have these kind of tight turns, and the key to kind of mastering the game is figuring out how to drift around the corners so that you don't hit the wall and lose speed. And the physics are not very realistic, but they're perfectly tuned for that kind of gameplay, and kind of drifting around the corners and maintaining speed. And once you get really good at it, I mean, you're just like kind of like floating across the track, and it's such you get into this kind of like zen kind of experience with it. And the visuals are excellent. It has that kind of the PS it's like, PS1 is really famous for kind of having the like warping polygons and stuff, but this is very clean aesthetic. It's really technically impressive visually for the PlayStation 1, and that just kind of adds to the sense of speed and the whole experience. When you're playing, you're never taken out of it. It feels very kind of very zen when you're driving. And they did some interesting things to give it a little more personality. You have you pick from between four different racing teams at the beginning, and those kind of represent difficulty levels. But each racing team has a different like owner or manager that you kind of have dialogue with um, at, during the between races. And depending on how you do in the races, they have different dialogue. And so you kind of see there's a little bit of like character development with them as you progress through the kind of racing events. And then also there's a lot of content to this game. There's a ton of cars to unlock, and it's interesting the way that you unlock cars is based on how you perform in the Grand Prix. So the Grand Prix has a total of 8 races, and based on how you place in each race is what determines what car you unlock. So that can be a little frustrating if you're like going back to like complete the game. But it does mean that if it gives every player like their initial few times through a really unique experience, because if you're really learning the game, you're not going to get first every time. And so, depending on how you do and as you improve, you're going to unlock different cars, and it makes that revisiting the experience really valuable. And then one other interesting thing they did with this is there's a second disc, and the second disc is actually has a version of the original Ridge Racer on it, but it's running at 60 frames per second, which is really rare for games on the PlayStation to run, especially polygonal games to run at 60 FPS. And that kind of shows like the progression, like the PlayStation launched with the first Ridge Racer, and it was really impressive, like home port at the time. But it was only 30 FPS, and some of the visuals, were downgraded from the arcade. And then with this version that they put on the second disc, it's like silky smooth 60 FPS, looks way better, and it's like it kind of shows like how Namco had kind of mastered the PlayStation in those like 4 years from 1994. Like it was a way for them to kind of brag and like, look, we can do the original game the way we originally wanted to do it. And that's also like a really cool little extra that they include in the game. And yeah, it's just such a great experience, and it's still pretty simple too. So it's really approachable for people, even if you're not super into racing games or you haven't played a lot of them. Anybody can pick it up and play it and enjoy it.
I have to say, as somebody who is generally not into racing games, I was a little bit like not sure what was going to come out of this like I wasn't expecting to be able to contribute to the conversation here. And I was like, you are everything you just said makes me want to play this game, which I was not expecting. And also hearing what you said and then kind of looking at the notes in like about the soundtrack, that one or like that especially is like I feel like I need to go listen to this soundtrack just because it sounds so uh it seems like there's a lot of variety to it too, as far as what it has on it, and I really want to check that out.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of like variation in the soundtrack in terms of like musical styles and everything that it employs, but it still manages to like feel cohesive, which I think is like a really hard thing to do when you're combining so many different, elements and genres of music together. And it also just fits the experience of playing the game so well. Um, but even if I would definitely say listen to the soundtrack, because I think the soundtrack does also stand on its own, even apart from the game, and uh, is truly excellent, especially for that era of video game music.
Yeah, I haven't stuck with racing games really either throughout the years, but I did play the original Ridge Racer, and there was just sort of there's a different feeling or a different sense about that game than there was about modern ones. So to hear that there's this title which improves upon that somewhat, it does make me curious as well to go back and maybe take a look. Certainly to check out the music, as you've said.
Yeah, yeah, and I think too, like, if you enjoyed the first one, the like I said, the bonus disc has the first one on it, so you can
Mm,
kind of like get that experience again, but it's like the premiere
better.
experience or the experience they wanted to give you at launch. Yeah.
It's so funny to see them iterating on something so quickly. I suppose I was going to say you don't see that now, but you probably do a bit.
I mean, how
Yeah.
many of The Last of Us remasters did we have at
Yeah.
this point?
Yeah.
Is there another one out since since last week? Or?
Probably since the beginning of
Yeah.
this recording, actually. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, like, because it's a game that like I knew about and I've played a little bit, like just like at friends' houses or whatever. But hearing you talk about it and also sort of reading about it beforehand, I'm like, oh, this is like a game that was working on a different level, in particular, like the UI and the style of it. And when it comes to a racing game, like what do you do to distinguish yourself, right?
Mm.
And it sounds like this game knew how to distinguish itself, which I think is awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's very easily accessible today. Like it's on PS4 and PS5 as one of those like PS1 classics or whatever. It's on PS3 and Vita too, and if you buy that version, you get the PS4, PS5 version. So, yeah, definitely, I encourage everybody to play it. It's great.
Yeah, I think I just might. So that brings us to the end of our games. We've talked about 12 games, I think, very in depth, and didn't go as long as I was afraid it would. So congratulations, thank you for that. And you guys did a great job talking about these games. I have like 4 games now that I need to go play immediately,
That is
which
the
I
downside.
can't do. Yeah. So thank the 3 of you so much for bringing such a variety of games here. It's so easy for us to just be like, well, it's Final Fantasy. And of course, I was the one who said Final Fantasy, but a great job of talking about these 12 games. And I really enjoyed our conversation. So let's talk about what's coming up next. So 2 weeks from now, there will be an episode. It will be another draft episode. It's going to be a BioWare draft. I will have nothing to do with it because, like a number of the games that we've discussed today, I haven't played them. So we're going to have a BioWare draft that Wes will be hosting, and I'm very curious to hear it, even though I don't know BioWare nearly as well as I should as the host of an RPG podcast. After that, though, there are 2 games that I am extremely familiar with. So we're going to have revisited episodes. We're going to have a Suikoden 1 revisited episode and a Suikoden 2 revisited episode, in honor of the recently released remasters. I, of course, will be hosting those episodes, and I am extremely excited to talk about 2 of my favorite games of all time again. If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us, retro@rpgfan.com. You can also follow RPG Fan on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Twitter, Blue Sky, Twitch, YouTube. We're usually RPG Fan or RPG Fan.com on those platforms. You can also follow us on Discord. There's also an RPG Fan shop if you want to support us and also get some cool stuff. There's one storefront hosted by TeePublic where you can buy mugs, t-shirts, things like that. You can also buy our review card collection, which is a collection of 300 RPG Fan reviews collected into the card format that you may have seen on Instagram. And that's sold by Hyperplay RPG. And you can also get there at our shop link on RPG Fan. We also have 2 other fine podcasts. Random Encounter, which is every other Monday about usually current events, current things, and current video games that we're playing right now. And then Rhythm Encounter, which is about RPG music. You can also review us on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, lots of different places that you can get podcasts. You can review us in all those spots. And let's talk about where we can get in touch with the individual panelists, starting with you, Paul.
Yeah, for me, it's mainly Blue Sky at the moment under my name, Paul Skevington. Yeah, come and see me.
Awesome. And Lucas.
You can find me on pretty much every social media platform still, for some reason, as Raefgal, Raefgall, and you can find me on YouTube where I have Let's Plays of several of the games that we talked about.
Indeed. And Ben.
Yeah, I don't have a really big social media presence, but you can email me at benloganlove@gmail.com.
Good for you, Ben. And thank you again, the 3 of you, for chatting about these games, making me want to play lots of them, except for, again, Paul's, which I'm not going to be doing.
Oh, I feel victimized here. This is persecution.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. It's because you're British.
I knew it.
Anyway,
I knew it.
Anyway, thank you, listeners. Good night and good luck.